Hello everyone, welcome to another one of my Leetcode videos. So today I will be solving this dynamic programming question, which is solving questions with Brainpower. So I haven't actually done this before. Yeah, let's get into it and solve it together. So this question is basically saying that we are given a zero-indexed array of questions, which basically represents each item in the array represents the number of points you get with a question, and then the brain power you drain by answering the question. And the brain power that you drain means that you can't answer the next how many questions based on the drained brain power. So in this case, like the first question gives you 3 points, but then you drain a brain power of 2, so you can't answer the next 2 questions. If you choose to answer the second question, for example, you drain a brain power of 4, and then you can't answer the next 3 questions, and so on. So you are to find which questions you should answer. Like you can either solve a question or skip a question, such that, and what is the maximum points that you can get for the exam with these questions, given those rules. So again, I think this is again a dynamic programming question similar to Leetcode 83, which was just my previous video. So let's start by creating the mathematical model. The max points you can get by starting, I guess, at index I will be equal to, so you have, at each index I, you have 2 choices, right? So either you answer the question, or you don't, or you skip the question, right? So it's going to be a max of the 2 choices, right? So your first choice is to answer the question. So here's if we answer it, and the second choice is if we skip it, right? So if we answer the question, the points that we'll get is obviously the points at I plus max points at I plus brain power at I, right? So we get the points at I, but then we can't answer the next 2 questions, so we have to go for, if this was 0, we have to then skip the next 2 and go for the max points we get by starting at 3, which is I plus brain power at I guess plus 1, right? Because we don't answer the next 2, and then we can answer the next, we can start at the one after that. So this is if we answer the question. Now if we skip the question, the points we'll get is simply max points at I plus 1. So this is if we skip the question. So again, as you can see, this is a recursive function where to compute max points of I, we need the max points of, some certain things after I. And we can assert that the max points of any I that's greater than the length, the questions at I dot, the questions dot length. So if I is greater than or equal to questions dot length, then you simply don't get any points. That's for the overflow case, right? So if, let's say, if you answer the last question, it's 2 points, but then you can't answer the next 5 questions. So what our formula will try to do here is to get max points of, let's say, I in this case is 0, 1, 2, 3, plus 5, which is plus 1, which is 9, and max points of 9 is greater than the length of the questions. It's kind of like out of the array. So it's basically 0, right? So we don't get any points beyond questions.length. And another important base case we need is for the last question, which is for basically questions.length -1. The max points you can get if you start there is basically just points at questions.length -1. So if you start at the last index, then the max points you can get is simply points at questions.length -1. So there's nothing after that, so the brain power you spend doesn't really matter, right? And so using this mathematical model, we can now proceed to writing the code. So we are given that questions.length will be at least 1, so we don't need to worry about questions being empty, and we can start computing this. So I just thought a function could be useful because we need to handle the case where we try to look for something that's greater than questions.length, but we'll get there. So yeah, let's start. So first we need to compute the max points at questions.length -1, right? So we'll have an int max points. So we need to store everything since we have to dynamically access the index based on the brain power value. So we'll need to store everything as far as I can tell. So the length of this array will be equal to questions.length, and then what we need to do is we need to set the max points at questions.length -1 to be equal to, which is basically this one, to be equal to points at questions.length -1. Now the way to get points is basically questions at questions.length -1 and 0, right? Because this is basically a 2D array where the first part is the points and the second part is the brain power. So this is how we get points, and I think this is where we can create a function. So we can say private get points int questions int I, and we can say return questions at I at 0, right, just to make it a bit simpler. And then we can just say get points at, actually we need questions.length -1, right, because that's what we need here. And I assume we'll need a similar function for brain power, so I'll just create that beforehand. So we'll say get brain power, and brain power is basically questions at I at 1, which is the second part of this 2D array. And so now we have our max points at length -1. So now we just go backwards. So we can say int I equals questions dot length -2, I greater than 0, I minus. And the reason we're going backwards is because if you notice, to compute I, we need everything after I, right? To make sure that these values are available. And so that's why we're going backwards, because we compute the points for the last values first, and then we go backwards to get the points at each point, the max points at each point. So yeah, so now we just plug it into this formula here and we can say max points at I is equal to math.max, and the first is if we answer it, so we say get points at I plus get and here's where I'll use the function. So I'll say get max points I plus get brainpower I plus 1, and I'll pass in max points. So our get max points can just be int max points int I, and here's where we can say, because there's a possibility that this will be greater than the size of max points, right? If the brain power is too much, it'll overflow. So here's where we'll incorporate this thing. So we'll say that if max points, if I is greater than equal to max points dot length, which basically should be the same as questions dot length. That's how we created it here. Then we return 0. That's basically this rule over here. Otherwise, we just return max points at I, because then it exists in the array, and we're only calling this for future max points, which, since we're going backwards, is guaranteed to exist. And so this is the first part here, which is if we answer the question, or if we solve the question. And the next part is if we skip the question, it's basically just max points at I plus 1. So we'll do the same thing. Get max points of I plus 1. And in this case, we don't really need to call the function, because I plus 1 is guaranteed not to overflow, because we start at length minus 2, and we've already computed length minus 1. So as an optimization, we could just use this one, so we don't go and check this on this a second time. So we could just do that, and that's if we skip, this will be I plus 1, and that's if we skip the question. And at the end, what we want to return is max points at 0, because that's the max points we can get if we start at the start, which is what we want. So yeah, let me run this and see what happens. Of course, compiler. Let's see, we don't have a return value. Okay, that's the problem. So this should be an integer. It should also be an integer. It should also be an integer. And so this should be a long, because we need long as a return type. Let me update that, and I assume this should be a long too, because this is a long. Let's try that now. Oops, control didn't work that well. Oops. Okay, it can't find get points. Okay, so here points is integer while max points is long, so I think we can just cast this one to a long. Or we can just say 0L plus. Oh, this is the problem. Okay, I need to pass questions as well. So I need questions and then the index. And the same thing over here. So get points, I need to pass questions. And get brain power, I also need to pass questions. Okay, finally, and I'll just change this to a cast, since I like that a bit better. Alright, so it seems to work on the example. Let's submit it and see how that works. Perfect. Not the best, but good enough. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video and stay tuned for the next one. And yeah, subscribe if you like my content.